Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another session of the 17th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. I'm Bob Hales. I'm your moderator. We have with us Dr. Hannah Howell. She is an assistant professor at the University of North Alabama, specializing in instructional technology and design. Her research is focused on academic continuity, instructor presence in online courses, and integrating emerging technologies in education, particularly artificial intelligence. Like everybody needs to be talking about that, right? We're fortunate to have her with her because she's an active presenter at many international and national conferences. She's going to talk about now what, how to leverage instructional technology to prepare for the next crisis. Hannah, it's all yours.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks, Bob. Again, I am Dr. Hannah Howell. And so before we get started, I want to kind of share a little bit about my professional background and give you just a little disclaimer about the research in this study and what I'm going to present to you all today. So I am an assistant professor at the University of North Alabama, but I started that position in 2023. Prior to that, I was the assistant director of instructional technology support at the University of Alabama. And so this was my dissertation study. And it is kind of based around my experience trying to lead an extremely large institution into COVID and then out of COVID. And so I worked there for 10 years in various positions. Most of the time it was spent in this assistant director position. And so it was my job to come up with our department's continuity plan. Um, Now, I have a passion for that kind of planning. Prior to getting into the realm of education, I thought I was going to be a research meteorologist. And so I really wanted to work with FEMA and I wanted to research how people prepare for natural disasters. How did that warning come through? How did you get it? How did you react to it? More of the social side of how people react to weather. And in just a minute, I'm going to show you some pictures of what actually changed that career path to education. But I just wanted to give a little disclaimer that I'm going to talk about the University of Alabama, and we're going to talk a little bit about what was done wrong, but a lot about what was done right and how it is currently being fixed. But also know that I do not work there anymore, and this is not a representation of anything that they do wrong or right or how it should be done. This is just what the research showed. So we can get started. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the crisis events that kind of inspired this study. We're going to talk about the crisis management cycle, which is a framework that you can use to work through your crisis management and create your continuity plan and how to use technology to make sure that you're prepared for the next one. We're going to talk about common issues with continuity planning and then how you can practically implement this because when we talk about continuity planning, sometimes we are talking about pie in the sky, things that may never happen or the likelihood of happening are so low, but you still need to have a plan for it. And so, how can you practically implement these things without disrupting your normal operations on a normal day? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to overcome obstacles. So now that I've given you my employment disclaimer, let's talk a little bit about the first natural disaster that inspired this study. So I was a student at the University of Alabama when this happened, and I was about 2 months from moving into my full-time role as a senior. And the pictures that you see are a road, like a main thoroughfare through Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that is less than a quarter of a mile from the actual campus. So on April 27th, 2011, an EF4 tornado struck less than half a mile from campus. And you see, like, the top picture, that used to be a Japanese restaurant. Um, the red building was a pizza restaurant, and just beyond that was an entire neighborhood. And then the bottom picture is part of a neighborhood and three restaurants that no longer no longer existed. And so all of the housing that was destroyed in that bottom picture belonged to students at the University of Alabama. And then the housing that is behind the red building in the top picture was also majority of student housing. So what happened here was that we had to end the spring 2011 semester early and we had to move finals online. And this presented an issue because we had a plan in place, but we had never practiced the plan. It was just on paper, and no delegation of duties had happened. So, without getting too much into the structure of UA, there is a technical department for online courses, and there is a technical department for face-to-face courses. And what had never happened was a conversation of what happens when all those face-to-face courses have to move online. Who is the primary point of contact? Who is going to help move all of these courses online? And what ended up happening is that it was just kind of who emailed who, and then there was no access to online courses for the face-to-face group. There was no access to face-to-face courses for the online group. So it was about kind of sharing information and figuring out how to get through that. If this was going to happen, we were really lucky that it happened when it did because we were able to pretty seamlessly move this online. Finals were made optional for students. And really, we were about within a week of the semester ending anyway. But you'll see at the bottom, so within the town of Tuscaloosa, 53 people died, six of them were UA students, and 5,300 buildings were destroyed. So this essentially was a humanitarian crisis, not only for the University of Alabama, but for the city of Tuscaloosa. The campus was without power and water for several days, so you had students in dorms that didn't have access to essential functions. The generators were on, but that is limited when you have several hundred students living in the same place. And so this was more about recovering the human and not so much trying to recover uh, the academic year. So from this, um, we kind of worked as an institution to create a plan. So, how are we going to handle the next crisis? And so, relatively speaking, we live in the South. We live in Tornado Alley. Some people call it Dixie Alley this time of year. We get really nervous when it gets warm, when you get that fake spring, and when you get a drop in temperatures, because that normally means we're going to have tornadoes. And that happens for us from about November to April every year. So, along the way, after this tornado, we had some small instances of tornado warnings where we had to move students into safe places. There might have been a small one that, hit town or just north or south of town, but we were relatively lucky over about the next 10 years to not have to deal with any kind of large scale issue. And over those 10 years, we worked as an institution to create a plan. What were we going to do if we didn't have access? If that tornado had moved half a mile over, and it was a direct hit to campus, what would happen to the infrastructure? How would we keep classes going? Do we have transfer agreements with other institutions? And thankfully, the transfer agreement was something that we had in place. And that was based from Hurricane Katrina in 2004. Our medical school was able to take two-lane transfers. So that was kind of already on the radar, and that was pretty much fleshed out. But what we did here was we created a plan that was based in weather. We created a plan that was based in what happens if our physical infrastructure is the problem. Well, as many of you know, March 13th, 2020, our COVID hit. And March 13th was the day that our entire campus moved to remote operations due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Students remained off campus until August of 2020, and alternative instructional methods would continue through the fall of 2021. Now, what my department did after we kind of learned and grew from the tornado incident was we knew that we had to have a plan ready to push out content to any course that we already had online courses developed for. So every semester we would make a list. We had instructors. We basically prepared for that every semester. So we were ready. The campus Administration gave us an extra week of spring break. So March 13th was the Friday before our spring break. So students were given a 2 week spring break to help move everything online. And the two offices that were responsible for technology support were much better prepared this time for that shared that shared kind of impact of a crisis event. So the face-to-face took care of faculty issues. Our online group took care of all student issues for all 38,000 students. We were able to successfully transition all of our 10,000 classes and 38,000 students online within this 2 week period. Um, and so we were able to do it. Did we do it well? I think we did the best that we could. But I think we also learned really quickly that instructional design is more than just putting stuff online. So our instructional designers took on alternate roles as more of a consultative service. If we had a face-to-face instructor that needed to move online, there were meeting times and dedicated online meeting spaces set up so instructors could come meet with instructional designers and talk through a problem. Hey, I need to do this in my class. This is what we were going to do. And so they worked together to move everything online. So we were relatively successful here. But what we realized was that our plan was very bias toward weather. So we had only considered that the physical space was the problem. The physical space would be inaccessible. We hadn't really considered that the people that occupy the physical space would be the problem. And so this goes kind of back to the pie in the sky thinking of how do you prepare for all of these different scenarios and how do you make sure that your technology infrastructure is ready for this? So, um, we were able to do it, but it was just, and with all things, you could do it better. So we really did a deep dive into this crisis management cycle by Zidziarski. And so really it is five different, I guess, stages. So the first thing you do is you plan. And so you make this plan and then you go through it and you make sure that all of your different scenarios are addressed in some way. Then we go into prevention, and prevention is going to look a lot different depending on what crisis you're trying to prevent. So when we think about issues with, say, things like civil unrest or like an active shooter situation, that prevention looks a lot different than preventing loss of instructional time for a time of remote learning. So prevention for your active shooters is making sure that you're a weapon-free campus. The use of metal detectors is part of your institution's plan. That's one way you can prevent it. But prevention for that remote space is going to be making sure that you already have the technology infrastructure to make sure that you don't have the loss of instructional time. So that can include maybe generating an online section within your learning management system for every class, regardless of if it's online or not. And this study took place specifically in one of the colleges that had the most robust continuity plan coming out of the tornado. So this specific college worked really hard to create this plan. They practiced it, and that can be part of prevention also, is making sure that you practice what is on this page. You don't want the first time you ever experience it to be when a crisis is currently happening. And then the third stage is going to be your response. So how are you going to respond to all of those different options? So the response for, civil unrest, active shooter kind of response, again, is going to be different than if you have to move remote. So when we talk about response for this remote learning space, who is responsible for what? How have they been using this in everyday life? How can we move it online? Um, how can we make sure that we have appropriate people trained to make sure that when all of these tests for all of these courses have to be moved online in a short period of time, who's trained to help do that? And also, how can you cross-train people to help with that? So, an example of something that the University of Alabama did really well was they have a help desk for students and faculty who need help with their hardware computers. So, excuse me. So one thing that we saw was we have these people who are good at this hardware technology, and they couldn't do their job anymore because they weren't in a building accepting computers to wipe viruses off of them or help put certain softwares on computers. So while they continue to do that in a limited capacity through virtual means, we were able to kind of retrain them to help do some of those tasks that I just mentioned. So using Respondus to move multiple choice tests online, or helping answer the phones and being able to hear a problem, and already having a technology background that was able to be generalized across multiple fields. Now, it is completely it's unattainable to think that any institution could have every instructional designer they would need in case they need to move 10,000 courses online. And what would happen if you needed to move this test? Like, that's not attainable for normal operations, but you need to have a plan for who can you retrain and who can you use for a different purpose after a crisis hits. And the next is going to be recovery. Again, recovery is going to look different. So in the case of the tornado, recovery looks like remembering those six students that passed away in the tornado. I don't know if any of you are if you're familiar with the University of Alabama, you know what Denny Chimes is. It's a bell tower that is on what we call our quad, and it plays songs. It plays the fight song. And every April 27th, at the time the tornado hits it. Um, it makes six specific tones for the six students that died, and then it makes another 47 tones for the people in Tuscaloosa that actually passed away. And then there's an area of the quad that gets set up because that was a larger outbreak of severe weather. And so across the state of Alabama, 252 people died. And so recovery there looks like just a way to remember people. Um, had we taken a direct hit, it looks more like how do we start rebuilding the infrastructure? How do we help students find housing that lost housing? Um, but the recovery for this remote work and this remote learning situation looks more like how do we get people safely back into these buildings. And then the learning phase is the reflection. And I think we're kind of seeing that in all of our institutions now. So we were all affected by COVID. Not everybody has been hit by a tornado like that, but everyone was affected by COVID in some way. So what did you learn from that? What worked well? What didn't work well? And what do you need to change? And then after you create that reflection, then you move into planning. But the study really showed about 8 different issues throughout the continuity planning that I think apply to everyone. So we were taking a reactive versus proactive approach. So reactive meant that we didn't have after when the tornado hit, not everyone had a section online that they could use. So we had to increase our server space, and we had to do that after when we were in the stage that we should have been responding to the crisis. We could have done that in the prevention part. And then instructional technology implementation. So you have all of these different technologies that can be used, but not everyone is using them, nor do they have training on them, nor do we have the support and staff to make sure on a large scale that this is available to everyone in a quick manner. Um, and so that all of those instructional issues are kind of grouped into one, that if we already have these tools on the system, we need to make sure that they're available to the courses within reason. We need to make sure that there is training available. And then we need to make sure we have the people to staff it. Now, the staffing goes back to the repurposing some employees if needed that can help with that. And the next thing, this may be very, very University of Alabama, but the frustrating thing for someone who was helping with this planning and helping with this implementation is that it got out on a news source that we were going to shut down before we actually heard from the the system. The University of Alabama is a system. There are there are two other institutions that make up the University of Alabama system, and they were all shut down at the same time. And we learned about this from like a blogging news outlet before it came out there. And so make sure that when you're planning continuity that and I realize that that may not be attainable all the time, but as someone who was trying to plan and it was hard for us to decipher what was right, what was wrong coming from this, and that continued throughout the entire pandemic. So make sure you're on the front edge of your communication. The next one, continuity exercises. This one was really interesting to me. Is the intentionality when you are conducting these exercises. So the specific college that I'm talking about, they would pick a continuity day every semester. Excuse me. And they would require that they would always require that a course had the syllabus and one assignment within the learning management system, whether it was a face-to-face course or not. So they would wake up at 6 a.m. that morning and have a message from the dean saying this is a continuity day. We're going to practice it. Keep all of your classes home. Well, in some cases, they didn't make sure people didn't come to the building. So, one of the most interesting stories that I heard over and over again through the study was one specific incident of the only time they ever used Zoom for a meeting. They decided to practice it for their faculty meeting, but all of them took the faculty meeting from their office. So, when the person next to them couldn't get onto the Zoom meeting or couldn't hear or couldn't get their camera to work, they would just yell down the hallway, "Hey, I need help." And someone would get up from their desk and they would walk, fix it, and go. So, are we practicing Zoom? Yeah, they did. Um, but they practiced it from within the building. So then when we had to move everything online, they were not ready for that at all. And then the next one, we're going to talk a little bit about research operations. And so this isn't necessarily about your social science research that, generally maybe online are more conducive to know face to face. This is more like what to do with your research labs. So your chemistry, your physics, your biology labs. Um, what are you going to do for that? So we had a plan to move our research operations to one of the other two institutions um, within the system. But again, that was biased to the tornado because that's assuming that the other two, which are admittedly about an hour and then 2.5 hours away from Tuscaloosa, there's bias there because we assume that those buildings would still be standing. It was not considered that people would be the problem. So how do you continue these research operations, making sure that their people are safe? What if you can get to the building, but you are the threat and not that your infrastructure is not standing? And then there were issues outside of instructional technology. So, how do you ensure the work-life balance of your employees? So, what we saw just in the city of Tuscaloosa was that our K-12 systems went back later than the university did. So, university started transitioning back on campus in some way in August of 2020. But a lot of our schools did a virtual of that next school year. So how do you manage requiring people to start transitioning back on campus, but also making sure that the infrastructure is there to ensure that they can participate if for whatever reason they can't. So if the school system is out on a large scale, the Tuscaloosa City schools generally took that entire first semester to come back. And so you had employees whose kids were students in the Tuscaloosa City School and they were starting to be required to come back to work. So how do you kind of manage all of those different aspects of continuity planning? So the practical implications of all of this is create a plan and make it detailed. So we found that Ziziarski's crisis management cycle was a great place to start. It gives you a framework that is general enough to kind of give you the flow of what should happen, but it's not strict enough to influence the plan outside of what would be um, what your institution could handle and how your institution is unique. Practice it and make it a surprise. Make sure to meet and reflect after each continuity drill to make changes to the plan. Again, that's something that we learned that we had an online faculty meeting that everybody was taking from their office. So that tech support was right next to you or your office mate. And that's not feasible and that is not what a real life crisis would present. So how do you make sure that how do you make sure that you practice it and it simulates to the best of your ability a real crisis event? The next part is don't forget the research. Research labs with face-to-face component needs special consideration. If you have a biology lab, who's going to take care of the animals? For example, the biology building at the University of Alabama has a snake lab in the basement. So who's going to take care of the snakes? Um, and how can we use technology to help with that? Be proactive about training and the online options available at your institution. So, for a lot of institutions, it's not feasible to have a lot of expensive technology that's just sitting waiting on a crisis. But how can you use what you have to create this plan? And more importantly, do you have people trained to do that in the event of a crisis? Remember that your employees are humans and they have needs outside of the workplace. And don't forget to consider factors outside of the office. So, we're all seeing a push right now to make sure that we are back in the office um, and to make sure that, we have a physical presence wherever we are, but making sure that you're still using that technology that was put in place for COVID to ensure that if someone does have to stay home for whatever reason, that they can actively participate and you still have that sense of community. The next part is incorporate technology into normal operations. So again, a great place that I think we started was making sure that every course had an online shell. Everyone had a syllabus online, and there are different technology trainings that happen on campus every month that make sure that people can go and make sure that people are ready to use the technologies that are kind of lying in wait in the background. And in a lot of cases, the learning management systems these days have a lot of these technologies built in. And so you don't necessarily have to spend a whole lot of money on a proctoring service if you have something like Respondus Monitor that lives on the back of your system. And again, that's just one specific instance to the University of Alabama that may not be available everywhere. But dive into your learning management system, see what is there for you to use, and make sure that you at least have a basic understanding of how to access it and how to use it in the event that something happens. So, overcoming obstacles. We know that crisis can happen to anyone at any time, and the best way to avoid major disruptions is to have a plan. Make sure that you include all staff levels in continuity planning, not just leadership. And so you want a really representative continuity committee, if that's how your institution works, that includes not only your provost, president, dean, associate dean level planners, you also want to have representation from the people that are actually doing the job. So, your administrative professionals, is there something that they have that can only be accessed on campus? How do we make sure that they have the technology they need? And sometimes they're the only ones to tell them. I am very lucky with my administrative professional. She just comes in with all of these systems that I don't even know the name of, and she just does little things behind the scenes. And my courses are loaded for me. My travel reimbursements, they just kind of happen as long as I give her the documentation. So there are parts of her job that I don't know about, and there are parts of my job that maybe my assistant dean or my dean don't know about because they have been in a leadership role. So it's really important to make sure that you include all staff levels and have good representation there to make sure that your continuity plan is complete and make sure that it is applicable to um, all of your employees. And then if certain operations can't participate in a drill, have alternative exercises to ensure thought is given to ensuring continuity of operations. So the example that I like to give here is that when my office started practicing continuity, we couldn't just shut the office down for an entire day. So we had a large studio where instructors would fly in from wherever they were to record lecture videos for courses they were designing. So to make it fully a surprise, you can't warn this department not to have anybody fly in on February 6th. But you also can't cancel the flight for people that are here. And so what we had them do was go in and kind of they were given kind of a template, you know, what did you do today and how would you have moved that online if needed? And what alternate planning could you have done? So their exercise was just it was almost like a debrief at the end of the day. And through that debrief, we were able to kind of take that information and add that to the plan of what would happen if we had to record these videos online without interrupting anybody's flights or really just the flow of that office. So that is all I have for you today. Does anybody have any questions?
Oh, I got a whole bunch of stuff to share because we were talking before we started. Um, I was involved in those kinds of discussions when I was with the state system of higher education in Pennsylvania. Part of the system was composed of 14 schools, and we started gaming out different scenarios. And man, that was eye-opening. So, for example, the system did and does a lot of video conferencing and delivering courses that way. So, what happens when uh, there's a blizzard in the state? You know, the director in charge of the whole IT operation is, well, we could just move all the classes to video conferencing, and then everybody's going, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I said, well, if it's a blizzard, how are they going to travel to the video conferencing sites? And it's like, oh, we didn't think about that. So this was just presumed that there were some other desktop video conferencing applications. So that's something we wanted to invest in. Um, Also, the system office, a lot of important functions that go on there. At that time, um, they still printed the payroll checks at the system office. And it's like, okay, our little campus is right across the street from the Susquehanna River. Well, a couple of times it had flooded. The campus itself was okay, but the surrounding streets were flooded. We couldn't get to campus. What are you going to do? And well, okay, this is where you need to move to direct deposit. Quit printing the checks. You save all this other stuff, but it's how you continue to pay people. It was identifying who are the key individuals that need to be communicate with one another. Do they have the tools to communicate? What are the whole range of technology resources we have um, things like IT told people, turn off your computers at night when you go home. Well, that's great. I understand the reasoning, but what if then the system office is surrounded by water? You can't get there. You want to work from home,
Hmm.
but you can't access all the data on your office computer. What are you going to do? So it's like, okay, this is some policy things. Then one school had their IT operation uh, in the basement of a building. Well, that's not so good. One time when it flooded, the basement got flooded. So putting IT in a basement wasn't a good idea. And but something you touched on is making sure people have basic skills to operate technologies when needed. Even though a faculty member may not teach an online class, they need some basic skills in case they have to move online.
Hmm.
And so that became a goal for us. Make sure they all had basic skills. Okay, I'll shut up. But it was a great experience. It would reveal a lot of problem areas.
Hmm. And that's the reflection part of that framework is that you realize what your problem areas are, and then you're able to kind of move back into the planning phase. So the more you practice it, the more those weak areas are going to be exposed, and the more you're able to prepare. Anybody else have questions?
I'll say one more thing. The other
Yeah.
thing was some policy issues. What happens if one campus, a tornado hits it? The campus is going to be out of operation for a while. But students, they're supposed to be going to class. So, first thing we thought was, well, we could just have our students go to another one of our campuses, continue there if they have the same program. Well, the problem was my dog doesn't agree. Problem, the problem was somebody, provost of one campus said, okay, yeah, they transfer we have a committee that will look at their, records and determine whether they got. That wasn't going to work. They needed to start those classes. So we came up with a system-wide policy. If they were accepted at one of our schools, they were accepted at all of our schools. So there was a policy issue that had to change. Well, I scared everybody off, I guess. I'm sorry. In this day and age, it is true. You've got to be able to, prepare for various things, and particularly where we are, tornadoes are a big issue, and you got to be ready to deal with it. Waiting until a tornado is sighted and heading your way is the wrong time to start planning.
Right.
Well, you know, a lot of the folks are faculty, and some of the things we've talked about are not their level,
Hmm.
but they need they need to think about this. What happens if students in my class can't come to class?
Right.
Can I deliver a different way? How am
Hmm.
I going to do that?
Yep.
Can you still hear my dog barking?
Olivia.
She went outside and she's still barking. So I hear it.
Thanks everybody for coming today. I think I have, let's
Well,
see.
Hannah, I thank you for doing this. This is, as I said, I found this a really important issue to talk about that often isn't talked about. So thank you for taking your time to do this.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me.